So no prelude on this. I'm just gonna, I guess, shoot fish in a barrel, responding to a Joe Rogan video. It's not even a Joe Rogan video. It's it's a channel called Fight Mediocrity that cropped together some Joe Rogan. I guess this is sort of the best of, because it warrants its own little graphics-friendly video. It's awful. The other videos on this channel are awful. I say this more and more, but I think this is just the dumbest channel on YouTube. And I know it doesn't mean much because I do say it more and more, but this really is just breathtakingly stupid, so I want to play a bit of it. And yeah, it's low on the totem pole, but what the hell, I sort of deserve a silly video to respond to, given that I had another more difficult video idea that kind of fell through, so I just want to, that's like the equivalent of junk food uploading, responding to a video like this. Oh, I said I wasn't going to do a prelude, but then I did a prelude. Ah, too bad.
I think that there's a lot of people out there that think somehow or another you're going to get to some place where you're living in silk sheets and you're getting your toes done while someone's dropping grapes into your mouth. I don't...
Okay, so I just have to play it again because it's stunning, even dumber on the second listen. So I'm going to just listen to it for a third time because you cannot believe that he just says this and doesn't feel the need to defend it with anything. Listen to this.
I think that there's a lot of people out there that think somehow or another you're going to get to some place where you're living in silk sheets and you're getting your toes done while someone's dropping grapes into your mouth.
So the complaint is that the current culture is too passive in thinking about how one gets from point A to point B, right? It's not actually what it is. It's not the culture that values endless busyness. No. It's, well, pretty much the aristocratic culture of centuries past. Because that's what aristocrats bragged about, is all their excess leisure time. And he thinks that that's what the average person runs on, is that when they get to, from point A to point B, they'll get to live the sort of aristocratic life. When we see, repeatedly, the elites and the people in high valued positions, they are workaholics and a polar opposite of what the people who occupied these high power positions centuries past. And we see it in what they brag about. They brag about their busyness. So he's just got it completely wrong when he thinks that this is somehow a motivational factor for some number of people.
I don't want that. I've never wanted that. That guy's not going to be happy. He's going to be bored.
So he doesn't want that. Fair enough. Thank you for expressing yourself. We should all express ourselves more, what we want. But then he goes on to say that that guy's not going to be happy. How does he know this? Does he quote any statistics? No, he doesn't. At least not in this compilation crop-up.
Hour into the grapes. You can get those fucking grapes away from me. Stop painting my toes. What am I doing in this bed? I got to do something. I'm not stimulated. The human organism that...
Not stimulated. And see, of course, his idea of stimulation would be activity, non-passive activity. The moment you're stimulated, but in a passive sort of way, where you're not on the move, you're not on the go, you're not being a go-getter physically, well, you're not really being stimulated. So introspection, reflection, vicarious observation of content, be it reading, watching, listening, no, none of that counts as stimulation for Rogan. And it's stupid. No, there's active, engaging forms of stimulation, and there's passive ones. And he's getting all these things mixed up because, well, he's on TRT and HGM. Yeah, that's a low blow. I shouldn't make a fuss out of what he's on. Maybe he would think the exact same thing if he wasn't on it, so I retract that. But I don't retract it enough to leave it out of the video. I just retract enough to cut out a part of that vent and resume from here on out.
The human organism, the animal that we are, needs constant stimulation because it evolved trying to find food and...
So, not just stimulation, constant stimulation. So I wish you would quantify this. How many hours a week? How many hours a month? If that makes it easier. Maybe how many days a year, right? Does it need to be a stimulation jam-packed day? How many days out of the year? You're going to have to answer some of these questions. You can't just talk in these broad strokes without specifying. You're giving people advice, presumably self-help advice, so you got to get more precise on this stuff. But the other funny thing about this is the word constant stimulation. from a podcast host who has had more mindfulness-friendly guests and long-form interviews with mindfulness-friendly guests than any other podcast host, anyone else who uploads anything on the internet, right? Can you think of anyone who has had more pro-mindfulness people come on their show to plug their bullshit? And just the irony of this is that me, being someone who is fairly hostile to mindfulness and most of these other spiritual practices, which are all about de-stimulate, right? Just clear your mind and do nothing for some, like depending on maybe as little as 10 minutes a day or maybe as much as 2 hours a day. Declutter your mind, not just your activity, but your mind too, right? So I'm sitting here and I'm skeptical of this stuff. He's the podcast host who nods his head to this sort of stuff, guest after guest. They don't come on the show and talk about it for maybe just a few minutes and then they go on to the next episode. No, they talk about it at length for hours. If we tally up all the hours where Joe Rogan nodded his head to someone giving the thumbs up for mindfulness and not just doing nothing, but actually thinking about nothing, decluttering your mind, self-performed lobotomies, that's Rogan. That's him being friendly. And yet, what the fuck is this video in the wake of all that history? Can you make sense of this at all? I'll play the last few seconds again, just because it's so absurd. Constant stimulation, he says it. And none of the people in the comment section call him out for it, because of course, because that's why I respond to videos. It's because I see something that's so patently self-contradictory. If you take the individual's entire upload history, or just overall ideology that they espouse, and you see glaring contradictions within seconds, and then you go, well, I'm sure some of the most highly upvoted comments in the comment section will be the comments pointing out these glaring flaws. And then one stroll after another, and you see nothing but positive comments receiving the video warmly, and no one points out any of the contradictions, which are obvious. They're ABC stuff. And then I feel the need to respond to the video.
Human organism, the animal that we are, needs constant stimulation because it evolved trying to find food and escape enemies, and find shelter, escape nature, escape the elements, try to survive. And this is the great joy that you have in taking.
He's got a man holding a baby as the great joy, as he says it. I'll insert that in the corner as it's playing as well. Yeah, we evolved a lot of things that have nothing to do with what's advantageous and disadvantageous within the context of civil society. And we have modified our behavior, sometimes to great extent, so that we can actually be more fitting for the civil society context, even if over time that hasn't exactly been friendly overall in terms of what our natural development would have been. And I think if you weigh the pros and cons of that, yeah, we are less physically, we're less tenacious and less gritty as a result of that. But hey, we learned a whole bunch of stuff that we otherwise wouldn't have learned. So to frame this, we evolved and therefore what? We evolved and therefore there's no pros and cons to just go with the flow of what we evolved to do? No, of course there's a pro and con. And sometimes, yeah, you're going to have to suppress certain motives so that you can do certain other civil things. Apologies for the siren.
Care of your children, that you can protect your children from the elements and the enemies and feed them. And it's also the great sadness that you...
And the way to do that now is to actually spend less time fine-tuning your tenacity and things of that nature, and focusing more on the cognitive, cerebral, analytical, fine-tuning those kinds of chops, and especially the way the economy is going. The whole learn to code advice is the sort of advice you want to give if you want to give your kids a sort of heads up. That's what you expose them to, and that's what you yourself do, because the bigger an income you have, the more well off your child's going to be. There's a pretty straightforward connection to that. But he's talking about what you had to do in the ancestral environment to give your kids the best possible life prospects. And yeah, very, very much emphasis in that environment on physical feats. But even though that's what we were evolved to do, you want to give your kid the best possible life in the current environment, you will not focus on the physical feats, and you'll focus on sharpening the cognitive feats. So, silly.
Children, that you can protect your children from the elements and the enemies and feed them. And it's also...
Now, of course, then I should do the caveat where I'm not talking about all societies with my rejoinder here. I'm talking about developed or developing societies.
So the great
However many countries on that OECD list.
sadness that you see in losers. When I see a loser, I see some guy who's 43 years old.
Loser by what measure? There's people who are losers in whatever their weaknesses are, right? So they wanted to do something really bad and it just never came to fruition. But then they're really good at some other stuff that they don't really have a passion for, and that sort of stuff still puts a roof over their heads or impresses enough people within his community or whatnot, and so they don't view him as a loser, but he views himself as something of a loser because what he really wanted to do, he never mastered it, right? So this silly binary, loser-winner binary, it's, at least when it comes to some percent of the population, it's actually gray area. They got strengths and they got weaknesses, and I think that if we're gonna, well, what they think of themselves at the end of the day probably should matter more than how the community perceives them. But like this video doesn't even attempt to grapple with anything close to a gray area when it comes to some of these truly interesting, fascinating questions about who's a loser and who's a winner. It just assumes, based on what he's about to say here, that that guy is indeed a loser. And at no point asks, well, what does that guy himself think? Which is really absurd because on this channel, this very channel that cropped this together and put graphics on it, the channel did a sort of Stoicism 101 video, and the guy talks about how absolutely nothing's good or bad, it's just what we think about it. So this is one of these stupid platitudes within Stoicism, which is overkill, which I'm perfectly happy to critique, but it's just strange in the context of a video like this, where he sets out objective criteria for what's bad and almost avoids asking, well, what would the person even think of it?
I see a loser. I see some guy who's 43 years old, who lives in his parents' basement, and he fucking hates the world. I'm like, that was a...
Wait, so hating the world is one of the big ingredients to being a loser? So how bad would the world have to get before you start sort of going beyond mere constructive criticism of it or mere dislike of it and plunging into full-blown hatred of it? No, your reactive attitudes to states of affairs at large that have nothing to do with you, you can have a negative reactive attitude. It's not going to reflect anything about you and you potentially being a loser. Loser, especially if we look at that video from that other, I'll link that other Stoicism video as well, right? It's you can't come up with objective measurable criteria because that the video itself stipulates at the outset nothing's actually good or bad. It's just how we come to think about it in the aftermath of the event happening.
43 years old, who lives in his parents' basement, and he fucking hates the world.
A lot of this non-Anglo societies, they still do the extended residential family structure. So the fact that this would even be something, just an immediate marker of loserdom, that a 43-year-old guy lives with his parents, well, it's often the case that, especially in the Far East, right, you do stay with your parents, you do stay in the basement, so you can actually take care of them once they're no longer capable of taking care of themselves. So just uploading videos to a global medium that'll be watched by presumably some people who are not within that Anglo custom-friendly region, and some people inevitably in the Far East who will probably be living with their parents in their 40s because they're obligated or they feel obligated to take care of them. And yet here's Joe Rogan using it as a immediate marker of loserdom. Well, not necessarily. And what is this basement like? Right? So he's got a fat guy eating popcorn and watching TV. What TV show is he watching? Is he watching something potentially educational? Right? What did he do prior to sitting on that sofa? Maybe he did have something of a fairly busy day. Does he actually like his basement? If he likes his basement, what the fuck's the problem of it being a basement? Right? These are just tropes. Come on, Joe, you've had a lot of smart people on your show over the years. How can you be such a trope machine? I mean, when he gets in his fucking element, he's a trope machine, and he ought to be called on it.
When I see a loser, I see some guy who's 43 years old, lives in his parents' basement, and he fucking hates the world. I'm like, that was a baby.
Hates the world. So anyone who hates the world, that's immediately, we gotta treat them as suspect.
Man, this is a baby that somebody just gave shitty nutrients to, whether it's nutrients in the form of food or in the form of thoughts and ideas and examples. And this kid developed these horrible, self-defeating patterns of behavior that have led them.
So let's just assume that this person does actually loathe the situation they're in. So he talks about everything that led him up to that. Rogan paints a picture of it's all internal, right? Wherever you get at, it's because of internal decision making, internal thought patterns. And statistically, if you want to talk about statistics, which this channel doesn't do, but if you actually want to dig into why people end up where they end up, chance events have been underestimated throughout everything from pop psychology to social psychology. And the sort of studies that social psychologists thought they had rock solid, well, we know about the replication crisis, which affected social psychology more than pretty much any other social science. So those go out the window. And in place of them, what can we do? What can we point to? We can point to a book I've read a couple of times by Robert Frank. It's called Success and Luck. And it shows all the ways in which chance events are actually dominant in determining who ends up where. I'm not saying that internal factors, decision-making, thought patterns, actions play no role. Robert Frank doesn't make that point, but he makes the point that it's far more frequent than we give credit for, especially when it comes to these self-help gurus and motivational channels that want to attribute pretty much 100% of things to internal explanations, when the external is actually far more prevalent.
To this point, where there's this middle-aged person with no future and no idea of how to get out of this rut and probably never will escape it and might just wind up sucking on a gun.
Well, if it's that bad to the point where he's sucking on a gun, what is the solution? Just listen to Joe Rogan tell him something that I'm sure he has considered over and over again? It could just be the case that he is introverted and that's what he's more comfortable with, right? The whole homebody thing. So to even start making this case, you have to actually point to some stats that show that homebodies are depressed at higher rates than go-getters and exhibitionists and workaholics. And I don't think that's the case. I think especially with workaholics, we know that they're just drowning in stress. So if anyone's going to end up getting depressed, then we know stress is one component of people being anxious, and we know there's some connection between anxiety and depression. So if we're going to talk about preliminary evidence, then I think I can draw a connection in the opposite end, not homebodies, right? I mean, yeah, just not worried about. There's a book called The Joy of Missing Out. It's just, I forgot the author's name now, but it's a comprehensive sort of smackdown of the fear of missing out phenomenon, which is everything. That's what's motivating this whole video by Rogan, is the fear of missing out we have to take seriously because it'll depress us. But at some point I'll take some excerpts from the book called The Joy of Missing Out, and I'll read some of that, because that's a pretty good antidote to all this garbage.
This is the world that we live in today, and I think part of that world is because we have been fed this line of horseshit that you're supposed to seek comfort. And I don't think you are. I think...
Who feeds us that line of horseshit? When at the start of the video I explained that that may have been at some point a aristocratic feat. But nowadays, I think kids have it drilled into them pretty damn early on, right? We know the college prep thing starts in elementary school. Earlier and earlier with each passing decade, it seems. So I think the memes about how there's no such thing as free lunch, what else? Work hard, play hard. These are all things that have survived and have been pretty penetrable. Both mainstream culture and I would say anything that runs afoul of mainstream culture has also been infiltrated by that sort of stuff. So I don't think you're going to see too many people who think, he's essentially saying, like, the dominant mode in the culture is, oh, there is a free lunch. I'm not seeing that.
I think you're supposed to seek lessons, and you're supposed to seek difficult tasks and accomplishments, and through the
Whether the task is difficult or not has nothing to do with, it's all about the person's skill set or native talents, right? The more talented they are, or the more skilled they've become through hard work, the less difficult the task is going to be, right? So if you know you've got it in the bag, and that's all you need, that's your objective, is this thing that you've got in the bag because you're just naturally good, or you've come to be good, so it's not really difficult for you because you've already achieved it, and no one's going to outcompete you. So why should you go out of your way to strive for some additional difficult task just so you can become more? But wait, hang on, I've stipulated you've achieved this objective that you have, and achieving it is going to put you at ease, and you're going to be well off. But see, he wants to say that the task being difficult, the difficulty level is in and of itself intrinsically worthwhile. And I'm saying no. The only time the difficulty and the struggle aspect of it is going to be worthwhile is if actually you want to come in first place, and whoever's near enough might make you second place or third place, right? They're on your level. They're in your league in terms of their competence and their skill set. Then you want to go out of your way and constantly strive to become better. But the hamster wheel of self-improvement for its own sake, well, that's some kind of bullshit. I have never seen a single person give me an actual reason why, when you are good enough for whatever it is that you know you want to accomplish, and you know you don't have any subconscious bullshit running in your mind saying that there's actually something else I want to accomplish, then why give the thumbs up to the stupid hamster wheel of never-ending self-improvement?
those things. And
I'm not talking about intellectual self-improvement. There, we should always strive to self-improve. I'm just talking for these physical feats. I ran 20 miles yesterday, so I'm going to try to run 21 miles today in the same exact amount of time. And just keep upping the ante. Yeah, you're going to kill yourself when you make this eternal self-improvement project a lifetime-long project. It's wear and tear on your body. And you'd know that if you weren't on, well, the TRT stuff that you're on.
accomplishments, and through those things, and through doing things that are hard to do, even if it's just a fucking 90-minute hot yoga class. I do a 90-minute yoga class. That was the last.
So let's say you do that once a week, and then you spend the rest of your time actually learning up on stuff, let's say like obscure concepts that if actually more people read up on, we wouldn't have all these communication problems, we wouldn't have all this silo effect, we'd actually know how to interpret statistics, and we'd actually know what a proper epistemology looks like, right, as opposed to just something vague that tries to pass itself off as a rigorous epistemology. Right? If we actually could get on the same page, because we don't just do this physical activity thing every single day, we actually spend some time reading, and you're going to tell me that's going to make for a worse world?
minutes, I do not want to be there, man. And I definitely don't want to give 100%. And I can cheat. But if I don't, and I get through it, when that time is up and the lady says namaste and everybody gets up, I'm like, fuck, man, I made it. I lost.
Yeah, and I'd say like once or twice a week, good enough. Good enough for me anyway, and good enough for a lot of people that I know. But watch what he's going to say next. He's going to need to do it consecutively every single day. If he misses a day, oh, it's depression time.
15 pounds, my fucking yoga mat is drenched to the point where I can literally wring it out and fill a jug up with water. But through that struggle, I will now have a better day, and I better fucking do it again tomorrow. Or do something else.
Well, what if you don't do it tomorrow? What if you just do it a couple of times a week at most? What's going to happen? Yeah, you'll read more, and then you'll make less dumb videos and make less dumb contradictory statements. Or, at least, if you don't make less of those statements, you'll catch when you have a guest on who talks about some polar opposite that you actually disagree with, and maybe you'll call them on it because you think, oh, no, we shouldn't do the mindfulness thing. We should actually do physically exerting activities all the time.
Else, because if I just think, well, tomorrow I'm just going to coast and eat Twinkies and watch TV, Oh, hello, sadness, my old friend. Hello,
Is this speaking from experience? You had a rigorous exercise session day 1, and then day 2 you just ate Twinkies and that was enough? Just not exercising on consecutive days was enough to get you to get sad and depressed. Okay, well that's your psychological profile. There's different psychological profiles. You probably score very high on trait extroversion or trait openness. Other people score high in completely different areas, which predispose them to not get depressed simply for spending one day on the couch and eating Twinkies. And I'm not even making it's a recuperation. No, not a recuperation day. Just for its own sake, you're not really tired at the start of the day. You just want to fixate on concepts as opposed to feats. So again, testimony, didn't do anything bad for me. A lot of other people at no point. But he wants to bring how we evolve. He wants to invoke the ancestral environment into this to say that it applies to all people. He's got a single formula and he wants to apply it to all people, even though we know, and as much problems as I have with the Big Five classification taxonomy for personality types, whatever is true of different psychological profiles, as we learn more about it, I'm sure that none of this current knowledge about the Big Five will stay unaffected. It'll look as silly now as a lot of the stuff in psychology looked a century ago, looks to us now. So one thing that I'm sure won't change is the fact that people have profoundly different psychological profiles, and this video doesn't appreciate that. This video is all about panacea. Right? Joe Rogan's advice is the panacea to depression, if you want to solve it. No, it's probably panacea for people who score high in trait extroversion. That's about it. And maybe conscientiousness. At least one sphere of conscientiousness, the sphere that focuses on what you do with your life.
Depression, because when you're not doing anything, you feel like shit. And that's just a part of being a human.
You do.
Being. And we can pretend that we're something other than what we really are, and we can pretend, nah, me, man, I'm just cool, just chilling, doing nothing. Bullshit. You're a fucking human. You're a human being. You evolved from the hundreds of thousands of years of hunters and gatherers and people that were struggling. Human reward systems are carved deeply into your DNA. And if you don't respect that, if you don't respect the mechanism of happiness and fulfillment and what you really need to do in order to feel satisfied in life, camaraderie, love, family, friendship.
Family. So let's just say you can actually quantify how good a relationship is. And let's say that the familial bond style relationships in your life score 5 out of 10. And then the non-familial bond style relationships score something above 5 out of 10. Anywhere from as low as 6 out of 10 to 10 out of 10. I can make it very generous for my case by going as high as 10 out of 10, but I'll just say let's make it as low as 6 out of 10, right? So you can have a family rich life, but the relationships you will have will be as high as 5 out of 10 and no further, or 0 family members in your life throughout the entire course of your life, like you're an orphan, but at the end of the day, all the relationships in your life, if we do a crudely numerical analysis, they can be characterized as 6 out of 10. The moment I put it this way, obviously family per se is not relevant. The quality of the relationships is relevant, but family does not figure into that per se. It can have sort of correlations to that, but if you're gonna distill things into, what are the 3 things he distilled it into?
Love, family, friendship.
Oh, yeah, friendship, fair enough. But it wasn't the first one. There was something before love.
Love,
camaraderie.
Family.
But there's this family just completely irrelevant to that list of things. And let's understand, like, different people will need different, like when Carlin said he likes people, but he liked them in small doses. Like, there is a type of person who is that way. And what the hell's wrong with that? Liking people in different intensity levels, or maybe just in a non-intensity level overall. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Liking people in small doses is not just something that can be applied to him, right? So if he was authentic when he said that, and I believe he was very authentic, Why would we doubt it when it comes to all the people who were drawn to his routine? It's just, to me, very obvious that there's people like that, and that they're not lying to themselves, and they're not secretly craving more people time. No, they're craving more leisure time in solitude. And unless you can actually point me to statistics that say that over a long period of time, they actually changed their views on solitude, I've never seen a credible study on that, then quit talking out of your ass as if this is an inevitability because you appeal to the ancestral environment, which he's about to do.
Thousands of years of hunters and gatherers and people that were struggling. The human...
Yeah, so a lot of things were selected for because of those struggles. Tribal loyalties, very much still a part of our psyche, but different individuals are wedded to it at different intensity levels. We see clearly some individuals, it's all they run on. Like, they can't even come up with a political philosophy without that being a core feature of their political philosophy. That's how ensconced their mind is in tribal loyalties and tribal sentiments. Mythos, symbols, ethno-symbolism, all these things are phenomena because not everyone is equally plagued by those kinds of primordial dispositions. And if everyone were equally within the grasp of these things, then, well, everyone would be some sort of a ethno-nationalist or separatist or purist along tribal lines. But we see that's not the case. So we see in all these other dimensions of life how the ancestral environment is having unequal impact on this or that psychological cluster of people, identifier of people. So why wouldn't the same thing be true of just how much any given individual needs to struggle? Some people need to do it a lot, some people need to do it next to none.
You're a human being. You evolved from the hundreds of thousands of years of hunters and gatherers and people that were struggling. The human reward systems are carved deeply into your DNA. And if you don't respect that, if you don't respect...
I don't respect it in the sense that I resist the temptation to bash people who annoy me over the head when they get too fucking annoying. Right? That would actually activate a reward center in my brain. I've never actually acted on it. It's a lot of other things, insulting them, being overtly aggressive as opposed to passive aggressive. There's a lot of things in my day-to-day routine that I suppress because I know I live in civil society. And yeah, it's a cause benefit. And you suppress that stuff too much to the point where you're actually in denial that you're suppressing it, yeah, it's probably going to come out in ugly ways. But other people are very agreeable, right? So that's another big category. It'll probably be changed as the decades go on, but trait agreeableness, right? So they're very different from me in that regard. They can see people who are just polar opposite than them, and they can cooperate with them without being annoyed at the diversity of it all. Ideological diversity, attitudinal diversity, what have you. So just another dimension where you can't talk about this as if it's just one lump sum.
The mechanism of happiness and fulfillment and what you...
mechanisms, right? So different profiles involve different mechanisms and paths to happiness. If happiness really is the intrinsic goal, I don't think it is necessarily, not for our species anyway. For animal species, yeah, okay, but not for us. We need more of a pluralistic understanding of final goods. And happiness can play a big role, perhaps the biggest role, but it ain't the only role.
You really need to do in order to feel satisfied in life. Camaraderie, love, family, friendship.
And so I ranted about family, but even the other ones, just take into account that some people need it far more than others. And if they don't, point to studies that show that everyone needs it in more or less equal degrees.
Struggle, testing yourself, learning, all those...
Learning, fair enough, but understand that you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for yourself some of the time. A lot of the time, it is for a societal improvement goal. Because we see just how hollow a lot of the public discourse is. And it is because, again, some of the main things that can improve it are still very obscure. People who know about it, scholars, academics, intellectuals, they don't get into, they're not willing to muddy their toes, to maybe like open up a YouTube channel and respond to some people who are dominant on this site and to explain some of these obscure concepts. They're just content with chatting it up with their fellow academics. So there's like a tale of two internets type thing you can do when it comes to these problems. And so learning, yes, but learning specific things, namely epistemology. It's like no one even knows, no one can even characterize these long-standing problems in epistemology. Like how exactly do we answer the skeptic's challenge? Do we answer it by foundationalism, coherentism, reliabilism, evidentialism? See, all these things, just you never hear them. They just sound like gibberish, but they are positions that carry specific answers to questions that if they were out in the culture, if they were widespread, I think it would be edifying to the public discourse.
Things are imperative. They're all giant.
And no one's going to learn about that if Joe Rogan's telling them you got to go climb a mountain every single day. They'll probably actually unlearn the things that they know now because they'll be so goddamn tired.
Part of being a person.
Yeah, being a person. And again, this is just all this variation I'm talking about variation within the Anglosphere. Like you go outside the Anglosphere, then I can even go even more about all the ways that this video does injustice to individual variation and what different people need. So that's it. I should clarify that earlier when I plugged Robert Frank's book Success and Luck, I was talking about the internal-external dichotomy, causing people to end up wherever they end up on the success to failure ladder, and the internal one being what Rogan and self-help types like to emphasize, and then the external factors being what Robert Frank spent an entire book going over and explaining. But it's important to stress, and I'll play an excerpt from that book because I got the audio version of it, and I'll just play a couple of examples that he cites. But it's important to stress that when you say internal, that might be viewed as synonymous with things that fall under the banner of personal responsibility. And then when you say external, what shouldn't be done is assuming that the moment I say external, I mean to say structural, or systemic, or institutional. I don't. I simply mean chance events, seemingly trivial events that actually have the sort of cascading effects that make all the difference. Not a little bit of difference, not even modest amount of difference, no, that make all the difference, even though they are initially very trivial seeming. But a cascading effect is a sort of invisible line effect. We don't see it. And instead of just aping the examples from Robert Frank, the ones I learned about by reading his book, I will just let him do the talking, or whoever did the audiobooks reading do all the talking. And yeah, it's not to be considered synonymous with the fault of the system, just because it's not a matter of personal responsibility. So it's another bad dichotomy. We think if it ain't a matter of personal responsibility, we can point to the system. Or you can't point to the system, it's got to be a problem with personal responsibility. No, it can simply be random chance events. And those don't get discussed nearly as much as they need to. Yeah.
Psychologists use the term hindsight bias to describe the human tendency to think that events are more predictable than they are. In the late 1940s, the sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld staged a vivid demonstration of the phenomenon by describing a study purporting to have found that World War II soldiers from rural areas were much better able than their urban counterparts to cope with the demands of military life. Just as Lazarsfeld suspected, people who read the results of the study found them completely unsurprising. Of course, the grueling lives led by rural men would make them much better equipped to endure wartime stresses. Why would anyone need a study to confirm that? The twist was that the study Lazarsfeld described was a complete fabrication. The actual study found the reverse. It was the soldiers from urban areas who fared much better in the military. Lazarsfeld's point was that when you think you already know what happened, it's easy to invent reasons for why it had to happen. Extending Lazarsfeld's work, the sociologist Duncan Watts has argued that hindsight bias operates with particular force when people observe unusually successful outcomes. The problem, he suggested, is that it's almost always easy to create a narrative after the fact that portrays such outcomes as having been inevitable. Yet every event is the outcome of a complex and interwoven sequence of steps, each one of which depends on those preceding it. If any of those earlier steps had been different, the entire trajectory would almost surely be different too. Watts illustrates his point with the interesting history of the Mona Lisa, easily the most famous painting in the world. During a visit to the Louvre, he noticed the ubiquitous throngs jostling for a closer look at the painting, even as several other canvases by Leonardo da Vinci from the same era went almost completely ignored in an adjacent gallery. To Watts, the Mona Lisa seemed no better than those other paintings. Curious, he did a little digging and discovered that it had languished in obscurity for most of its early life. What pushed the painting into the spotlight was apparently its theft in 1911 by Vincenzo Perugia, an Italian maintenance worker at the Louvre who tucked it under his smock before leaving work one evening. The theft, which was widely publicized, remained unsolved until Perugia was apprehended 2 years later for attempting to sell the painting to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. In Ian Leslie's account of the episode, the French public was electrified. The Italians hailed Perugia as a patriot who wanted to return the painting home. Newspapers around the world reproduced it, making it the first work of art to achieve global fame. From then on, the Mona Lisa came to represent Western culture itself. As Watts writes, we claim to be saying that the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world because it has attributes X, Y, and Z. But really what we're saying is that the Mona Lisa is famous because it's more like the Mona Lisa than anything else. Consider also the career of Al Pacino, one of the most celebrated actors of the past 40 years. Fans may find it difficult to imagine an alternative version of history in which he did not succeed as an actor. Yet his storied career owes much to one highly improbable early casting decision. Studio executives at Paramount wanted to cast Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, or Ryan O'Neal to play Michael Corleone in Francis Ford Coppola's film adaptation of Mario Puzo's The Godfather. Coppola, however, wanted an unknown actor, someone who actually looked like a Sicilian. Executives remained skeptical and at one point were on the verge of signing James Caan for the role. They backed down only when Coppola threatened to abandon the project. In the end, they cast Caan as Michael's older brother Sonny and gave Pacino the starring role. In Puzo's novel, Vito Corleone was the central character, but Vito's youngest son Michael is clearly the protagonist in Coppola's adaptation. Pacino, who had previously appeared in only 2 minor films, thus landed what turned out to be the most important role in what many critics have called the best film ever made. The unlikelihood of such a casting decision is underscored by the fact that Coppola was directing his first film at the age of 33. Inexperienced directors almost never get their way in disputes with studio bosses. Pacino's subsequent career affirmed the wisdom of Coppola's judgment. Those who believe that talent and hard work inevitably triumph might argue that because Pacino was relatively young at the time, his skills would have eventually made him successful even if he hadn't landed the Michael Corleone role. Maybe so, but there are also many thousands of highly talented actors who just never got the right opportunity to demonstrate their skill. Bryan Cranston, for example, was a middle-aged supporting actor when the producer Vince Gilligan proposed casting him in the leading role of his upcoming TV series, Breaking Bad. Once again, studio executives were reluctant to invest so heavily in an actor who had never been cast in a major dramatic lead role. So they offered the Walter White role to John Cusack. And when Cusack turned them down, they tapped Matthew Broderick, who also declined. Gilligan again pressed his case that Cranston would be right for the part, and executives finally relented. Breaking Bad went on to become one of the most successful TV drama series of all time, in no small part because of Cranston's riveting portrayal of the ailing high school chemistry teacher turned meth kingpin. Cranston earned 4 Emmy Awards during the show's 5 seasons and is now one of the most highly sought-after actors in the profession. He's a gifted performer, to be sure, but there are thousands of other gifted performers who continue to labor out of the limelight. It seems safe to say that Cranston would not have become a superstar if either Cusack or Broderick had taken the Walter White role. Career trajectories in acting offer some of the clearest illustrations of the positive feedback process known as the Matthew effect, after the verse in the book of Matthew that reads, "For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." The term was coined by the sociologist Robert K. Merton to describe how the ripple effects of seemingly minor events often profoundly alter the careers of scientific researchers. Is it possible to quantify the extent to which success in different domains depends on seemingly trivial chance events? The aforementioned sociologist Duncan Watts and his collaborators designed an experiment they called Music Lab in an attempt to answer this question for aspiring musicians. On a website, they posted the names of 48 indie bands and 1 song from each. My 2 youngest sons are the frontmen of The Nepotist, an indie band struggling to break out in the hyper-competitive New York City music scene. So I probably know more about indie bands than most people. But I had never heard of any of the bands posted on Music Lab. Visitors to the website could download any of the 48 songs on the condition that they provide a rating indicating how well they liked it. The researchers averaged the resulting responses to create an objective song quality rating. Objective in the sense that these ratings were made without any knowledge by respondents of how other people were reacting to the songs. These objective ratings were highly variable. A handful of songs got high marks from most listeners, and a few got low marks from most. But for the substantial majority, there was no consistent response. Some people really liked these songs, others thought they were okay, and still others gave them extremely low ratings. With those objective ratings in hand, the researchers then created 8 independent websites that contained the same 48 bands and songs as before. But each of these new sites also displayed some additional information. Visitors could now see how many times each song had been downloaded, and also the average quality rating it had received thus far. One of the bands in the experiment was 52 Metro. Their song, Lockdown, landed roughly in the middle of the objective scores, ranking 26th out of 48. This song's subsequent fate varied dramatically across the 8 websites that incorporated social feedback. On one, it ranked number 1. But it was only number 40 on another. The song's fate, it turned out, depended largely on how the first people to download it happened to react to it. If they liked it a lot, that created a halo effect that made others more likely to download it and respond favorably. But if early downloaders happened not to like it, things went downhill. The Music Lab findings suggest that many songs or books or movies that go on to become hits owe much of their success to the fact that the first people to review them just happened to like them. Works of unambiguously high quality are of course more likely to earn positive early reviews and may succeed even in the face of some early negative commentary. But most artistic endeavors elicit a broad range of subjective evaluations. Some go on to succeed simply because the first people to express their opinions about them publicly just happen to come from the right tail of the opinion distribution. Which is to say, many artistic endeavors owe their success, at least in part, to pure dumb luck. Many successful artists seem blissfully unaware of that fact. But there are refreshing exceptions. Consider again Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad. When Brett Martin interviewed him about the series' success for GQ's Men of the Year issue in 2013, Gilligan had this to say: "Have you ever been sitting at your desk and you crumple up a piece of paper and without even looking you just toss it over your shoulder and it goes straight into the wastebasket? You didn't think about it. You didn't stress about it. You just did it. And now that you're thinking about it, you could never do it again in a million years, no matter how hard you tried. That's what this was like. We worked our butts off, but everybody works their butts off in TV. We tried to make the best show it was humanly possible to make, but you know, the guys on According to Jim did the same thing. As to why this thing hit, I could make up some stream of nonsense, but honestly, I wish I could explain it, because then I might have a fighting chance on TV in the future. The truth is, I just have to be satisfied that it happened at all.